The sun broke over the ridge like a thin copper coin, too pale to warm, too distant to promise. On the slope they called the Poor Man's Hill, frost still silvered the grass, and the woman named Clara Sutton stood at the door of her cabin, watching her breath cloud and vanish. She was 42 years old, though the land had added a decade to her face. Lines at the eyes from squinting into wind, a permanent hollow beneath her cheekbones from winters when the flour bin ran low. Behind her, the cabin's roof sagged in the middle, and the door would not close flush against the jamb, no matter how many times she planed the edge. She had been on this hill for 4 years, and in 4 years she had coaxed nothing from it but thistle, iron-flavored water, and the quiet conviction that the town of Willow Creek had been right about her all along. They said she was a fool to buy unimproved land at the back edge of nowhere. They said a woman alone had no business trying to farm ground that had defeated 3 men in a row. They said it to her face and behind her back, and Clara had learned to let the words pass through her like wind through a broken fence. She had other things to hold on to. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women who were laughed at, the farmers who were counted out, the homesteaders who held their ground when the whole world told them to let go. Clara Sutton was one of these. Her story begins at its lowest, on a morning when the frost had not yet lifted, and she had just counted the last of her eggs and found she would have to skip supper again if she wanted flour for tomorrow's bread. But something was about to arrive on her hill that would change everything, something that seemed, at first, like a mistake, a foolishness, the final proof that the town had been right about her all along. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. It came in a crate that had once held apples. The crate was lashed to the back of a cart, driven by a traveling man named Ebenezer Tull, who had a habit of paying his debts in odd currency. Clara had mended a pair of his boots the week before, stitching new soles from a scrap of harness leather, and when he came to collect them, he had nothing but excuses and a strange bundle of living cargo. "I've got no coin, Miss Sutton," he said, rubbing his jaw, "but I've got something better, something you won't find in any barn in this county." He lifted the crate's slatted lid, and Clara looked inside at 6 fuzzy, peeping balls of dun and cream and chocolate brown. They were Guinea fowl, not the common gray speckled kind that farmers kept for bug control, but a different breed entirely. These were broad in the breast, with legs as thick as her thumb, and they had a calm, steady gaze that wild birds never showed. "From a ship's captain out of Africa," Ebenezer said proudly, "a breed they call the Numidian. Grows big as a turkey, lays twice as many eggs as a hen of the same weight, and eats ticks and grasshoppers like they're going out of style. The captain swore they'd thrive on thin ground where chickens would starve. I'll trade you the whole batch for the boots." Clara looked at the birds, then at the boots she had spent 2 evenings on. The leather was good, and the stitches were tight. She could have sold those boots for a week's worth of supplies. But the birds, if they were half what he claimed, could be more. She made the trade. The town heard about it within a week. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, especially when it concerned Clara Sutton's latest foolishness. Lige Morgan, who owned the general store, told her to her face that she had been swindled. "Those ain't proper poultry," he said, shaking his head over the biscuit she had bought on credit. "They're fancy birds for fancy folks back east. You'll have to keep 'em penned and fed grain they don't make on this hill, and they'll still die of the cold before winter's done." He was not unkind, but he was certain. The storekeeper's certainty carried weight in town. By the end of the week, Clara felt the laughter following her down the street. Not loud but persistent, like the buzz of flies around a wound. She carried it home with her and let it settle in her chest where it sat heavy and cold. But the birds surprised her. They did not die. They thrived. The hollow behind the cabin, where an old root cellar had collapsed into a shallow cave, a pocket in the hillside that stayed dry even in rain, became their shelter. Clara had discovered it the first winter when she was digging a foundation for a better chicken coop and struck empty space instead. It stretched back into the hill a dozen feet, with a ceiling high enough to stand in, and the walls wept no moisture. She had lined the floor with straw, and the guinea fowl took to it as though they had been born in such places. They roosted on the ledges, scratched in the dirt at the entrance, and laid eggs that were larger and richer than any hen's egg she had ever seen. Within 3 months, the 6 had become a dozen, and a dozen, within a year, had become nearly 50. And Clara told no one, because a secret was the only thing on that hill that nobody could take from her. The knock came on an April morning, when the wild plum was blooming at the bottom of the slope, white petals drifting across the grass like snow in the wrong season. Clara had just collected the morning's eggs, 23 of them, heavy and warm in her apron, when she heard boots on the stoop. She opened the door to find a man in a gray wool coat and a hat that had seen better days, carrying a leather satchel and a fold of papers. He was thin, with soft hands and a clerk's receding hairline, and he introduced himself as Mr. Theodore Finch, field assessor for the county tax office. "Miss Sutton," he said, consulting a note, "I'm here to update the valuation on your parcel. The current assessment is based on unimproved land, but I understand you've been making improvements, a dwelling, fencing, livestock." He smiled, but the smile had practice behind it, the professional warmth of a man who delivered news, both good and bad, through the same rehearsed curve of the mouth. "We'll need to walk the property and take a fresh count." Clara's apron felt suddenly heavy with eggs. She had never registered the birds. She had never filed a livestock declaration because the first year there was nothing to declare, and by the time there was, she had grown used to keeping them out of sight. The county did not know about the cave, about the 50-odd guinea fowl that roosted in its darkness, about the eggs she sold in secret to a trader who came through twice a month and asked no questions. If Mr. Finch found them, he would assess their value, and the taxes on that value would be more than she could pay on a year of mending boots and selling eggs under the table. She could lose the hill. She could lose everything. "Of course," she said, stepping out and closing the door behind her. "But there's not much to see. I keep a few hens for eggs, a goat for milk. That's the extent of my livestock." She gestured toward the small, visible pen where 6 ordinary Rhode Island Reds scratched listlessly. She had kept those as a decoy, the same way she kept a few sagging rows of beans near the cabin to show any passerby that she was trying, even if trying was not enough. "The land is thin, Mr. Finch. The previous owners gave up on it, and I'm not sure I've done any better." Mr. Finch nodded and pulled out a pencil. "I understand. Thin land is common in these parts. But the county requires a walkthrough for all parcels over 40 acres. I'll be as quick as I can." He smiled again, and Clara saw in his eyes the same certainty that Lee J. Morgan had shown. He had already judged her as a woman barely scraping by, and he would not look too hard because he expected to find very little. She led him down the slope first, toward the dead garden plot where the remnants of last year's beans stood brittle and brown. She showed him the iron well, drawing a bucket and letting him taste the water so he would grimace and write it down. She brought him to the fence that leaned at a drunken angle and let him test a post that wobbled in its hole. She talked slowly, dulling his attention with details, making herself as unremarkable as the land. All the while she kept him turned away from the hill's face, from the curtain of wild grapevine that concealed the cave's small entrance. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher, and the decoy pen's 6 hens scratched and dozed in the dust. But Mr. Finch had a question that she had not prepared for. "What do you eat, Miss Sutton?" He asked it as they stood by the sagging fence, his pencil still, his eyes on her. "You've shown me a failed garden, a poor well, a goat that gives little milk, and a handful of chickens. The county expects its residents to be self-sufficient, and I see no sign of a crop or a substantial flock." He was not accusing her, but he was curious, and curiosity in an assessor was dangerous. Clara thought of the eggs under her apron, still warm. She thought of the cave and the soft muttering of 50 birds. "I trade," she said. "I mend boots and harnesses for the town. I take payment in flour, salt, sometimes eggs or meat. It's not much, but it keeps me." She had told the truth, and the truth was safe because it did not mention the guinea fowl. Mr. Finch nodded and wrote something down. "Reasonable," he murmured. "And your livestock count? Just the goat and these 6 chickens?" "That's right." He looked up the slope, toward the curtain of grapevine. "Any other structures I should see? A shed? A smokehouse?" "Just the cabin," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "And the outhouse. Nothing else worth noting." Mr. Finch closed his notebook. "Then I think I have enough. I'll file the updated valuation. Don't expect much change. The improvements are minimal." "You'll receive a new assessment in the mail." He tipped his hat and started down the hill, and Clara watched him go, her heart beating a slow, grateful rhythm. She had done it. She had steered him past the secret. The danger was over. But Mr. Finch did not leave. He stopped at the bottom of the slope, where a patch of wild plum grew thick, and he looked back at the hill. Something had caught his eye. A trail, faint but visible, leading from the curtain of grapevine down toward the cabin. A narrow path worn by countless small feet. He looked at it, then at Clara, and she saw the change in his face. The soft certainty had hardened into something sharper. "Miss Sutton," he said slowly, "that path, what makes that path?" She did not answer, she could not, and while she stood silent, a sound came from the cave, a soft, questioning call. The sound of a guinea fowl asking if it was safe to come out. Mr. Finch heard it. His eyes went to the grapevine, and then back to her, and he began to walk up the hill, not quickly, but with purpose. Clara moved to block him, but she was too slow, too tired, too full of the weight of 4 years of secrets. He parted the grapevine and found the low stone opening of the cave, and he bent to look inside. For a long moment he did not move. Then he straightened, and when he turned to face her, his expression was not angry. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who had found the answer to a question he had not known he was asking, and who was already calculating what that answer was worth. "Miss Sutton," he said, "how many birds are in there?" She stood on her own hill, with 50-odd secrets at her back, and a stranger's pencil drawing numbers in the air, and she understood that the morning had taken a turn she could not steer back. The town's laughter, the assessor's curiosity, the path worn by small feet, it was all converging on the cave, and on the truth she had hidden for so long that the hiding had become its own kind of lie. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the first bird stepped out of the darkness, blinking in the sunlight, as if it had decided that the time for hiding was over. Mr. Finch stood at the cave mouth, his pencil frozen above his notebook, and watched the guinea fowl emerge into the morning light. First one, then another, then a cascade of them, dun and cream and chocolate brown, their broad breasts catching the sun, their calm dark eyes studying the stranger with a curiosity that was almost insulting in its lack of fear. He counted silently, his lips moving, and reached 47 before he stopped and looked at Clara with something that might have been awe, or might have been the dawning awareness of a very large number catching up to a very small notebook. "You told me 6 chickens," he said. "I did," Clara answered. "Those aren't chickens." "They certainly are not." He turned back to the cave and watched the birds fan out across the slope, scratching at the grass, calling to one another in their low, questioning trills. His pencil moved again, and Clara felt the weight of each mark as though it were being carved into her own hide. The county would assign a value to every one of those birds. The value would be multiplied by the tax rate, and the tax rate would be more than she had seen in cash in the whole of the past year combined. She thought of the mending work she had lined up, 3 pairs of boots, a broken harness, a split saddle girth, and tried to calculate how many hours of stitching would even begin to cover the assessment. The number did not fit inside her head. It was like trying to hold a river in a cup. Mr. Finch wrote the final number, closed his notebook, and looked her in the eye. "Miss Sutton, I have a duty to report the livestock I have observed. These birds are of a breed I do not recognize as common in this county. They appear to be large, healthy, and numerous. I will need to consult with a poultry expert in the county seat to establish a proper valuation, and the assessment will be adjusted accordingly." He paused, and his voice softened, as if he were about to offer a kindness. "But I should tell you plainly, a flock of this size on land of this quality will place a tax burden that exceeds the improvements you've made. You may wish to consider selling some of them before the assessment is finalized. That would reduce the taxable count." Clara shook her head. She did not know why she shook it, only that selling the birds felt like cutting off her own fingers to stop them from bleeding. These birds had asked for nothing but the cave and the scraps she fed them, And they had given her eggs and meat, and the quiet hope that she was not as poor as the town believed. "I'll find a way," she said. "I always do." Mr. Finch looked at the sagging roof, the leaning fence, the thin soil of the garden, and she saw him arrive at the same conclusion the town had arrived at years ago. He did not say it. He merely tipped his hat and started down the hill, the notebook in his satchel, the new assessment already taking shape inside his head. Clara watched him go, and the birds moved around her feet as though nothing had changed. And everything had changed. The news traveled fast. Within a week, every soul in Willow Creek knew that Clara Sutton had been hiding a fortune in guinea fowl behind her hill, and that the county was about to tax her out of her own land. Lige Morgan told it to every customer who came into his store, shaking his head over the candy jar. "Always thought she had a scheme," he said. "Turns out it was a nest egg, a big one. But she don't have the cash to cover the taxes, and you mark my words, she'll lose that hill before the snow flies." He was not wrong about the math. The official notice came in a cream-colored envelope with the county seal impressed in wax. Clara opened it standing at her kitchen table, the guinea fowl scratching at the doorstep, and read the new valuation. It was exactly what she had feared, more than she could pay, with a payment deadline of 60 days. She did what she always did when the world crowded in too close. She went to the cave. She sat on the packed earth floor with the warm bodies pressing against her legs, the soft trilling filling the dark, and she let her hands rest on the broad back of the oldest bird, a cream-colored hen she called Queen. "I don't know how," she whispered, "but I am not leaving this hill." Martha Bell heard about the notice on the same day it arrived. She was the widow who lived in the hollow below the hill, a small woman with gray hair and a voice that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. But she had a heart as wide as the prairie. She came up the slope that evening with a basket of dried apples and a jar of honey, and she sat with Clara on the cabin stoop without saying much. Finally she said, "I heard about the assessment. I heard about the birds, too. Not many folks would have the sense to keep something like that hidden for that long." "Not much sense in it if it's going to be taken away," Clara said. Martha was quiet for a long while, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Then she said, "I had a friend once, back in Ohio, who grew mushrooms in a cave. Nobody believed it would work. They said you needed sunlight, good soil, all the proper things. But she learned that mushrooms want what a cave gives: cool, dark, steady. She sold them to a hotel in the city and made enough to buy her son a house. The point is, sometimes what looks like a disadvantage is just a door you haven't opened yet." She reached into her basket and pulled out a smaller cloth bag. "I brought you some seeds, not for planting in the ground, for feeding your birds. They'll lay better through the winter if you give them something extra. I've got a friend in the county seat who deals in poultry feed. He'll sell you a sack at wholesale if you can get a letter to him. I'll write it for you." Clara took the bag and felt the weight of it, and the weight of Martha's kindness pressed against the weight of the tax notice, and for a moment they balanced. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. The days passed, and the weather turned warm, and the guinea fowl continued to thrive. Clara wrote to Martha's contact, and the sack of feed arrived, and the eggs grew even larger. She began selling them openly at the store, and Lige Morgan bought them at a fair price because they were the best eggs in the county, and even his certainty about her failure had to make room for that fact. But the tax deadline loomed, and the sum remained, and she could not see a way to bridge the gap. Then a man named Harlan Briggs appeared at her gate. He was the richest landowner in the valley, with holdings that stretched from the river to the county line, a man who bought farms the way other men bought grain, in bulk, without sentiment, and always at a price that left the seller feeling grateful they had gotten anything at all. He rode up on a fine bay mare, dressed in a coat that had never seen a patch, and he did not bother to dismount. "Miss Sutton," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I hear you've got a tax problem. I also hear you've got a hill that borders my best bottomland. I've got an offer for you." "I'm not selling," Clara said. She said it before he could name the price. "Now hear me out," he said, and there was a smile under his mustache, the kind of smile that had been working on struggling farmers for 30 years. I'm not offering to pocket your land. I'm offering to pay the taxes. In full, today, in exchange for a lien on the hill. You stay, you raise your birds, you pay me back over time at a fair interest. If you can't pay, the hill comes to me. But you get to try. That's better than a forced sale, isn't it? It was better. It was also a trap that Clara could see as clearly as she saw the wrinkles around his eyes. A lien meant he held the title. If she fell behind, he could foreclose. And he was betting she would fall behind, because everyone in Willow Creek was betting the same thing. But she had no other offers, and the deadline was 32 days away. "I'll think on it," she said. "You think fast," he replied. "I need an answer in 3 days." And he rode off, the bay mare's hooves scattering the guinea fowl that had gathered at the edge of the lane. Clara stood in the yard, the birds resettling around her, and she felt the walls closing in. The cave, the flock, the secret she had kept so long, none of it mattered if she could not hold on to the ground beneath it. She was on the verge of accepting Briggs's offer, of trading her hill for a debt she could not repay, when a memory surfaced. It was from the year before, a traveler who had passed through and traded her a handful of seeds for a pair of boots. He had said the seeds were from a plant called sainfoin, a legume that grew on poor soil, put nitrogen back into the ground, and could survive drought. She had planted those seeds in a corner of the garden that no one visited, a small patch behind the cave, and they had taken root and grown tall and purple-flowered. She had forgotten about them until now. She hurried up the slope, past the grapevine curtain, and around the side of the cave. There it was, 3 strides wide and 20 long, a patch of sainfoin in full bloom, the bees busy among the blossoms. The soil there was better than anywhere else on the hill, richer, darker, full of the life the plant had brought back. She knelt and ran her fingers through it, and she understood what the hill was telling her. The cave was not the only hidden resource. The soil had been healing itself, waiting for her to find it. That night she wrote a letter to Harlan Briggs. She declined his offer. She wrote instead to Martha Bell's contact, asking if he knew of any buyer for a large and regular supply of guinea fowl eggs, and whether a buyer might also be interested in a quantity of sainfoin hay for winter feed, a legume that could fetch a premium from dairymen who wanted rich milk. The answer came 6 days later, a letter on fine paper from a man named Mr. Pendleton, who ran a hotel in the county seat and had a standing contract for the best eggs in the territory. He would take every egg she could produce, at a price double what Lee J. Morgan paid, and he would be interested in the sainfoin come autumn. Clara held the letter and looked at the hill, at the cave, at the 50-odd birds scratching in the evening light. The tax notice was still in her drawer. The deadline was still 23 days away, but for the first time in 4 years, the arithmetic was beginning to tilt in her favor. She went to bed that night with the smell of sainfoin in her hair and the sound of guinea fowl settling into the dark of the cave, and she dreamed of a door opening on a hill that everyone had told her was worthless. And in the morning she woke to find that the queen had laid an egg the size of a small fist, the largest she had yet seen, warm and perfect in her hand. Clara held it up to the light, and the shell was so pale a blue it almost seemed to glow, and she thought of Martha Bell's friend and the mushrooms in the cave, and she whispered to the bird, "We are not done yet." She did not know that Harlan Briggs had not accepted her refusal. He had taken her decline as a personal challenge, and he had already sent word to the county clerk to expedite the tax collection process. He intended to offer her $20 less for the hill the moment the county moved to seize it. And he had spoken to Lee J. Morgan, planting a rumor that Clara's guinea fowl had been caught eating a neighbor's crops, which was not true, but which was the kind of story that spread through Willow Creek like wildfire through dry grass. Clara had 22 days left, a hotel buyer, a field of sainfoin, and a flock that did not know it was the center of a war. She had the queen's egg in her hand, and she had a secret that was no longer a secret, and she had a hill that had not yet given up everything it held. The rumor reached Clara on a Tuesday morning, carried up the hill on the breath of a south wind that smelled of rain and dust. It came not as a direct blow, but as a whisper she caught while standing at the edge of Lee J. Morgan's porch, waiting for him to weigh a sack of flour. Two women she knew by sight, but not by name, stood near the pickle barrel, and one of them said, "I heard they've been getting into Widow Harkness's corn patch. Her boy saw them at dawn, whole flock of them, stripping the stalks clean." The other woman clucked her tongue. "That's what happens when you keep creatures penned up with nothing to eat. They'll wander. They'll take what isn't yours." Clara felt the words settle on her shoulders like a yoke. She did not own a Widow Harkness, and her birds had never left the hill. They were too well fed, too content in their cave, too accustomed to the rhythm of her daily visits to stray even as far as the bottom fence. But the rumor did not need truth to travel. It needed only a listener willing to pass it along. She bought her flour in silence and walked home with the sack over her shoulder, the path stretching longer than it had ever been. The guinea fowl met her at the grapevine curtain, the queen leading them with her low trill, and Clara knelt and let them press against her skirts, their warmth a comfort against the chill that had settled in her chest. "They're saying you're thieves now," she murmured. "But I know better. You're just what you are, and that's enough." The birds blinked and scratched, untroubled by the opinions of the valley. Yet the rumor spread as rumors will, not because anyone believed it entirely, but because it was easier to repeat than to question. By Thursday, J. Morgan told Clara that two of his customers had mentioned her birds in the same sentence as the word nuisance. He said it with a shrug, as though he were merely passing along weather reports, but she saw the shift in his eyes, the way he measured her now against a new standard. She was no longer just the woman on the poor hill. She was the woman with the secret flock that was now a public problem. "You might want to keep 'em penned tighter," he said, not unkindly. "Folks get nervous when they hear about livestock wandering." "They haven't wandered," Clara said. "They've never left the hill." "Don't matter what's true," he replied, and he meant it as a kindness, though it landed like a stone. "Matters what folks believe." She returned to the hill and built a low fence around the mouth of the cave, a barrier woven from willow branches that would not stop a determined bird but would satisfy anyone who came looking for proof of confinement. She worked until her hands were raw, and the birds watched her from inside their dark shelter, their heads turning in unison like a slow, curious audience. The fence was finished by dusk, and Clara stood back and looked at it, knowing it was a gesture, not a solution, but a gesture was all she had. The days passed and the tax deadline drew closer, and Clara worked as she had never worked before. She gathered eggs twice a day, packing them in straw inside the crate she had built for Mr. Pendleton's shipments. She cut the sandfoin in the patch behind the cave, wading into the purple flowers with a scythe she had not used since her father's farm, the blade dull and the swing rusty, but the hay piled higher with each pass. Martha Bell came up twice a week to help, her gravel voice a steady presence, and together they tied the hay into bundles and stacked them in the cabin's back room to dry. The smell of it filled the small space, sweet and earthy, and Clara began to believe that the arithmetic might work after all. If Pendleton took the eggs at the price he had promised, and if he paid for the sandfoin at the premium rate his letter had suggested, she could cover the tax and have enough left for flour and salt through the winter. But Harlan Briggs had not forgotten her. He sent a messenger on a Friday, a boy on a mule, with a note folded tight and sealed with wax. Clara opened it standing in the yard, the guinea fowl gathered at her feet, and read, "Miss Sutton, my offer stands for 3 more days. After that, I will be forced to pursue other arrangements with the county. I do not wish to see you lose your hill, but I will not watch it sit idle while you cling to a dream that cannot support you. Think carefully. H. Briggs." She crumpled the note and shoved it into her apron pocket. The birds looked up at her with their calm, dark eyes, and she said to them, "He thinks he knows what this hill can support. He doesn't know a thing." But the words felt hollow, because she was not entirely sure she knew either. The sandfoin was cut and drying. The eggs were piling up. But Pendleton's next payment was not due until the end of the month, and the tax deadline was 16 days away. She needed the money sooner. She wrote a letter to Pendleton that afternoon, asking if he could send a partial payment in advance, and she sent it with the boy who had brought Briggs's note, paying him a penny from the jar she kept for emergencies. The answer came back in 4 days. Pendleton wrote that he was sorry, but he could not advance the payment. His hotel had suffered a fire in the kitchen, and all his funds were tied up in repairs. He would still honor their agreement come autumn, but for now he could send nothing. Clara read the letter 3 times, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. But they remained fixed and final. She set it down on the kitchen table and stared at the wall, where a crack ran from the ceiling to the floor. And she counted the days, 12 until the deadline. She had the sainfoin, but no buyer for it yet. She had the eggs, but no one to sell them to at Pendleton's price. Liege Morgan would take them at his usual rate, but that would not be enough. She did the arithmetic again, and each time it came up short by a sum that felt like a door slamming shut. The town's laughter grew louder. She heard it when she went to the store for salt, the way conversations paused and then resumed in lower tones. She saw it in the eyes of the men who gathered on the porch of the boarding house, the way they looked at her and then at one another, the small nods that said more than words. Liege Morgan, who had never been cruel, became efficient, weighing her purchases without meeting her gaze. The rumor about the birds had not died, it had evolved. Now they said her flock had grown too large, that the cave was unsanitary, that she was a danger to the whole valley's poultry. Someone had even written a letter to the county health office, though Clara never learned who. On the 8th day before the deadline, a wagon rolled up the hill. It was not Briggs, but a man she had never seen before, dressed in a canvas coat and a hat pulled low. He introduced himself as Mr. Sturgis, a buyer from the next county over, and he said he had heard she had a flock of guinea fowl for sale. Clara's heart lifted for a moment. A buyer, a way out, but the moment passed when he named his price. It was a fraction of what the birds were worth, less than half of what Pendleton had offered for a single season's eggs. "They're just birds to me," he said, shrugging. "I got transport costs, market risk. Take the offer or don't, but I won't be back." Clara looked at the flock, at the queen and her daughters, and the generations of broad-chested birds that had trusted her from the start. She could not sell them for slaughter at a price that would barely cover the tax and leave her with nothing. "No," she said. Sturgis shrugged again and drove off, and Clara stood alone in the yard, the dust settling around her. That night, Martha Bell came up with a lantern and a pot of stew. They ate in silence on the stoop, the guinea fowl settling into the cave behind them, the stars coming out one by one. Finally, Martha said, "I've been thinking about your problem." "So have I," Clara said. "I've worn a groove in my brain thinking about it." "Then maybe you've worn it deep enough to see what I see." Martha set her bowl down and turned to face Clara. "You've got a hill that nobody wanted. You've got a flock that nobody believed could thrive. You've got hay that came from seeds a stranger gave you for a pair of boots. And you've got a town that is waiting for you to fail, because failure is what they expect from this place. But you're not failing, Clara. You're just out of time." "And those are 2 different things." "Time is the only thing that matters," Clara said. "Without it, I lose everything." "Then borrow some," Martha said. "Not from a bank, from the land. Talk to your birds. Walk the hill in the dark. Listen for what it wants to tell you. Because I've been thinking about that cave. Why did your birds take to it so well? Why do they lay bigger eggs in the dark than they would in the sun? There's something about that hill that the rest of us haven't understood, and I think you're the one meant to understand it." Clara did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind move through the grapevine, and she tried to hear what the hill was saying. The cave was cool and dry and constant. The sainfoin had grown in the only patch of soil that had not been worked. The birds had come to her through a trade she had not sought. It all felt like a pattern she could almost see, like the shape of a face in a misted window. But every time she reached for it, it dissolved. On the morning of the 5th day before the deadline, she woke to find that the queen had not come out of the cave. Clara crawled inside with a lantern and found the old bird huddled in a corner, her breathing labored, her eyes half closed. She was dying. Clara gathered her into her lap and held her, stroking the smooth feathers, and the queen rested her head against Clara's palm and grew still. The flock gathered at the mouth of the cave, their low trills filling the dark, and Clara understood that she had just lost the oldest and wisest of her animals, the one whose steady laying had funded every sack of flour and every bolt of fabric for the past 3 years. She buried the queen at the base of the wild plum tree, where the petals had fallen and the ground was soft, and she marked the spot with a flat stone. The fourth day brought rain, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned the hill into mud. Clara bundled the sainfoin into the cabin to keep it dry, and she sat in the dark with her birds, listening to the water drip through the roof in 3 places. She counted her funds again, and again the number came up short. She thought of Briggs's offer, still standing, still waiting. She thought of the lien he had proposed, the debt that would hang over her like a cloud. And she thought of the queen, who had never asked for anything but a safe place to live, and who had given everything she had in return. On the third day, a boy rode up on a lathered horse with a letter from the county clerk. The letter was formal and cold. Unless the full tax amount was received by noon on the deadline, the parcel would be declared delinquent, and a sheriff's sale would be scheduled for the following month. Clara read it and set it down beside the flat stone under the plum tree. The rain had stopped and the sky was clearing, and the hill looked almost beautiful in the fresh light, the grass greener than it had been all spring. She walked to the cave and sat inside it, alone, while the flock foraged on the slope. She listened to the silence, the deep quiet of earth that had been hollowed out by time and water. She thought of the earlier owner who had dug the root cellar, and of the badgers that had once lived here, and of the seeds that had fallen through the cracks and grown into sainfoin. And she realized what the hill had been trying to tell her. It was not about the cavity of the cave, the warmth of the soil, the stillness of the air. It was about the way the hill held things inside itself, protecting them, ripening them, waiting for the right moment to give them up. The cave was not just a shelter for birds. It was a gathering place for everything that needed to grow in the dark. She came out of the cave with a new understanding, but the clock was still ticking. 2 days left. And then she heard the sound of wheels on the road and looked down to see Harlan Briggs riding up in his fine buggy, a paper in his hand, a smile on his face that she had seen before on the faces of men who believed they had already won. Harlan Briggs climbed down from his buggy with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already rehearsed the conversation in his mind and found it satisfactory. He carried a single sheet of paper, folded once, and he did not offer it to Clara immediately. Instead, he stood in her yard, looking at the cave mouth, at the low willow fence, at the guinea fowl that had gathered on the slope to watch him with their calm, unblinking eyes. "Miss Sutton," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I heard about your queen." Clara said nothing. The queen's death was still raw, a wound that had not yet scabbed over. She had buried her at dawn, and the flat stone still felt fresh in her memory, the weight of it against the wet earth. "I'm sorry for your loss," Briggs continued, and his voice carried the practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered condolences to dozens of struggling farmers, always with the same gentle tone that preceded an offer. "I know she was important to you, but that loss also changes the value of your flock. Without your best layer, the productivity drops. The county assessment, however, does not drop. It remains fixed at the valuation established by Mr. Finch." He held up the paper. "This is the final notice from the county clerk. The deadline is 2 days from now, at noon. I have arranged to be at the courthouse that morning, ready to purchase your hill at the sheriff's sale. I will give you $20 less than my original offer to account for the reduced value of the flock. That is my final proposal. Take it now, and you walk away with cash in hand. Refuse, and you will get nothing when the county sells it." Clara looked at the paper, then at the hill, then at the birds that had gathered around her feet as though they understood the weight of the moment. "You've had this planned all along," she said. "The rumor about my birds eating Widow Harkness's corn, the letter to the health office, the buyer you sent who offered me pennies. You've been narrowing the walls, forcing me into a corner." Briggs did not deny it. He tilted his head, his smile unchanged. "I am a businessman, Miss Sutton. I see an opportunity and I pursue it. You have a hill that borders my best land, and you have a flock that, in the right hands, could be very profitable. But these are not the right hands. You do not have the capital to meet the tax, and you do not have the time to raise the funds. I am offering you a way out that leaves you with something. That is more than most would give you." Clara felt the anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp, but she held it in check. She had learned over 4 years that anger was a luxury she could not afford. It burned bright and left nothing but ash. Instead, she said, "I have 2 days. I will use them." Briggs shrugged. "As you wish, but I will be at the courthouse at noon on the deadline, with cash in my pocket. If you are not there with the full amount, the hill is mine." He climbed back into his buggy and drove off, the wheels cutting deep ruts in the soft ground. Clara watched him go, and she did not let the tears come until he was out of sight. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, a lid of gray cloud that pressed down on the valley. Clara spent the morning wandering the hill, touching the sainfoin she had cut, running her fingers along the willow fence, kneeling at the cave mouth to feel the cool air rising from the darkness. The guinea fowl followed her in a loose procession, their trills low and questioning, and she spoke to them in the same quiet voice she had used since the first 6 had arrived in the apple crate. "I don't know what to do," she told them. "I have 2 days and no money, and I will not sell you to be slaughtered, and I will not give this hill to a man who has spent the past month trying to take it from me." The birds blinked and scratched, offering no answers. But the cave did. Clara had always thought of the cave as a shelter, a cool, dark place where the birds could hide from heat and cold and predators. But she had never truly explored it. She had lined the floor with straw and let the birds dig their own hollows along the walls, but she had never crawled to the back, where the badger set narrowed into a crack that seemed to go deeper into the hill. That crack had always been too small for her to enter, but the birds used it sometimes, disappearing for hours and returning with dust on their feathers. She had assumed it was a dead end, a shallow pocket that led nowhere, but now, with 2 days left and nothing to lose, she decided to find out. She took the lantern and crawled into the cave, past the birds that had settled for the afternoon, past the nests and the scattered straw, to the far wall. The crack was there, narrow and dark, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. She had never tried because she had never needed to. Now she set the lantern down and pressed herself into the opening, her shoulders scraping against the stone, her breath coming short in the confined space. The crack twisted and turned, and for a moment she thought she would be stuck, trapped in the dark with no one to hear her call. But then it opened, and she found herself in a chamber that had been hidden for a very long time. The ceiling was high enough to stand in, and the walls were lined with crystals, small, glittering formations that caught the light from the lantern and scattered it into 1,000 points of gold. The floor was dry and level, covered with a fine dust that felt ancient under her fingers. In the center of the chamber, a small pool of water had collected, so clear that she could see the bottom, where more crystals lay like buried treasure. The air was cool and still, and the silence was so deep that she could hear her own heartbeat. Clara knelt by the pool and dipped her hand into the water. It was cold and sweet, without the iron taste of the well. She drank from her cupped palm, and the water was the cleanest she had tasted since leaving her father's farm. The chamber was not just a cavity in the hill, it was a spring, a hidden reservoir that had been collecting water for years, perhaps centuries, filtering it through the stone until it ran pure. The crystals on the walls were not diamonds or gold, but they were something equally valuable, a sign that the hill contained a deep, steady source of clean water, one that could be tapped and used. She stayed in the chamber for a long time, letting the quiet settle around her. When she finally crawled back out, the guinea fowl were waiting at the entrance, their heads tilted, as if they had known all along what she would find. She sat in the straw and held the largest of them, a gray hen she had raised from a chick, and she said, "This changes everything." But the clock was still ticking. 2 days was not enough time to dig a well, to pipe the water to the surface, to prove to anyone that the hill held a resource worth more than the tax. She needed a faster plan, a way to turn the discovery into cash before noon on the deadline. She thought of Pendleton, still unable to pay. She thought of Lee J. Morgan, who would take her eggs but could not advance the full sum. She thought of Briggs, waiting at the courthouse. Then she thought of the crystals. They were not precious stones in the usual sense, but they caught the light in a way that made them beautiful, and beauty had its own value. Clara had seen polished crystals for sale in the store in the county seat, small pieces set in wire and sold as jewelry to the wives of wealthy merchants. She had never considered them as a source of income, but now, holding a fragment she had broken from the wall, she wondered if they might be the key. She spent the afternoon gathering the loose crystals from the chamber floor, filling a flour sack with pieces that ranged from the size of her thumbnail to the size of her fist. When the sack was full, she carried it to the cabin and spread the crystals across the kitchen table, watching them glow in the last of the daylight. They were not diamonds, but they were beautiful, and beauty, she hoped, could be traded. At dusk, she walked down to Martha Bell's cabin, the sack over her shoulder. Martha opened the door with a squint, and when Clara spilled the crystals onto her porch, Martha let out a low whistle. "Where did you find these?" "Inside the hill," Clara said. "There's a hidden chamber with a spring and crystals lining the walls. I need to sell them before the deadline. Do you know anyone who would buy them?" Martha picked up a piece the size of a walnut and held it to the lantern light. "I know a woman in the county seat who deals in curios and trinkets. She travels to the territorial capital twice a year and sells to the wives of politicians. She might take these, but it's a day's ride, and the deadline is the day after tomorrow. Then I'll ride tonight." "Clara, it's dark, the road is rough, and you haven't slept in 3 days. I have 2 days to save my hill. I'll sleep when it's done." Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll pack you a basket of food, and I'll write a letter of introduction to the woman. Her name is Mrs. Gilchrist. She runs a shop on Main Street called the Velvet Box. Tell her I sent you." She went inside, and Clara waited on the porch, the sack at her feet, the guinea fowl settling into her hill for the night. The sky had cleared, and the stars were coming out, and the air smelled of wet grass and the promise of spring. Clara left at moonrise. She borrowed Martha's mule, a patient, sturdy animal named Solomon, and tied the sack of crystals behind the saddle. The road to the county seat was 17 miles of rutted track that wound through the bottomland and over a low ridge, and she had traveled it only twice before, both times in daylight. Now she rode under a quarter moon, the shadows pooling in the hollows, the sound of Solomon's hooves the only company. She thought of the cave, the chamber, the water, and the birds. She thought of the queen, buried under the plum tree. And she thought of Briggs's satisfied smile, and she resolved that he would not have it. The town of Fairmeadow, the county seat, was smaller than she remembered, a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings and a courthouse at the far end. She arrived at dawn, stiff and cold, the sack of crystals still tied to the saddle. The Velvet Box was a narrow shop wedged between a millinery and a dry goods store, its window displaying a handful of polished stones and a single silver brooch. Clara tied Solomon to the rail and knocked, the sleep she had missed gathering behind her eyes. The woman who opened the door was small and neat, with silver hair pinned tight and spectacles perched on her nose. She had the sharp eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime making quick judgments about people and objects. "Yes?" Clara introduced herself and held out Martha's letter. Mrs. Gilchrist read it without expression, then looked past Clara at the sack on the saddle. "Show me." They carried the sack inside, and Clara emptied it onto a velvet cloth spread across a mahogany table. The crystals caught the morning light that slanted through the window, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. Mrs. Gilchrist picked up a piece the size of a hen's egg and held it to the light, turning it slowly. She did not speak for a long time. Finally, she set it down and said, "These are unpolished quartz crystals, but they are unusually clear. The largest ones could be cut into pendants or table pieces. I can offer you a price based on weight and clarity." She named a sum, and Clara did the arithmetic in her head. It was enough to cover the tax, with a little left over, but not enough to buy flour for the winter. She remembered the queen's last egg, the one she had held up to the light, the shell so pale a blue it seemed to glow. She remembered the sainfoin, the sweet smell of it drying in the cabin. She remembered the hidden spring, the water that could change the whole valley. "I'll take it," she said. Mrs. Gilchrist counted out the coins, and Clara tucked them into a leather pouch that she wore under her dress, next to her skin. She rode back to Willow Creek with the money warm against her chest. the sun rising behind her, the world slowly waking. She reached the hill before noon, and she found Martha waiting at the gate, her face heavy with news. "Briggs has been to the courthouse," Martha said. "He's already filed a preliminary claim. The clerk told him you wouldn't show. He's sitting on the porch of the boarding house right now, telling everyone that the hill will be his by supper." Clara dismounted, her legs aching, her eyes burning. She touched the pouch under her dress. "He's wrong," she said. "I have the money. I'm going to the courthouse at noon tomorrow, and I'm going to pay the tax." But Martha's face did not lighten. "There's something else. A dry spell is coming. The men at the store were talking about it. They say the creek is already dropping, and if it doesn't rain in the next 2 weeks, the bottomland will be as dry as your hill. The whole valley could lose its crops." Clara looked at the hill, at the guinea fowl scratching in the grass, at the cave where the hidden spring waited. The dry spell would devastate her neighbors. But her hill, with its deep water and its dry cave and its sainfoin that thrived on poor soil, might be the only place that survived. She understood then what the hill had been trying to tell her all along. It was not a dead place. It was a waiting place, a place that had been holding its breath until someone came who could see what it truly was. She went inside the cave, knelt in the dark, and touched the floor where the hidden chamber lay. "I see you now," she whispered. "I see what you are." And the hill seemed to shift beneath her, settling into the earth like a living thing that had finally been recognized. Tomorrow, she would go to the courthouse and pay the tax, and after that, she would begin to dig. The morning of the deadline arrived gray and still, with a heat that pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. Clara had not slept. She had spent the night in the cave, sitting among the guinea fowl, feeling the cool air rise from the hidden chamber where the crystals had grown, and the spring pooled in darkness. The leather pouch with the coins from Mrs. Gilchrist lay warm against her chest, and she had counted them 3 times by the light of a candle stub. Each time, the sum was the same, enough to cover the tax, with a small remainder that would buy flour and salt through the summer if she was careful. It was not a fortune. It was not even enough to feel safe, but it was enough to stay. She walked down the hill at sunrise, the pouch tucked inside her dress, her boots wet with dew. The guinea fowl followed her to the bottom fence, then stopped, as if they knew she was going where they could not follow. The road to the courthouse was 2 miles through the center of Willow Creek, past the store where Lee J. Morgan was sweeping the porch, past the boarding house where Harlan Briggs had spent the night, past the cluster of men who gathered each morning to discuss the weather and the price of grain. They saw her coming. The sweeping stopped. The conversation faltered. One of the men, a thin farmer named Ezra Platt, who owned the parcel adjacent to Briggs's bottomland, called out, "Going to pay your taxes, Miss Sutton, or going to watch your hill change hands?" Clara did not stop walking. "Going to pay," she said, and her voice carried in the still morning air. She heard the laughter behind her, low and rippling. Ezra Platt said something she did not catch, and the men laughed again. She kept walking, the pouch steady against her chest, the coins solid and real. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building at the end of Main Street, with a clock tower that had not worked in living memory and a flagpole that listed slightly to the left. Clara climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy door into a dim hallway that smelled of ink and floor wax and old wood. The county clerk's office was on the left, a small room with a high counter and a window that looked out onto the street. Behind the counter sat a man named Mr. Jessup, who had been the clerk for 40 years and had seen every farm in the valley change hands at least once. He looked up when Clara entered, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Sutton, I must say, I did not expect to see you today." "Nobody did," she said. She unpinned the pouch from inside her dress and set it on the counter. The coins made a soft clinking sound, heavy and final. "I'm here to pay the full amount of the tax assessment on my hill, in cash." Mr. Jessup studied her for a long moment. Then he opened a ledger, turned to the page marked with a red ribbon, and ran his finger down the column until he found her name. "The full amount," he repeated. "You understand that this is the assessed value of the improvements and the land combined. It is not a small sum." "I understand." He counted the coins slowly, stacking them in neat piles on the blotter. Clara watched his hands move, each coin placed with the precision of a man who had been counting other people's money for 4 decades. When he reached the last coin, he looked up and said, "It is all here, to the penny." He wrote a receipt in his careful hand, stamped it with the county seal, and handed it across the counter. "Your parcel is clear, Miss Sutton. The hill is yours, free and clear." She took the receipt, folded it, and tucked it into her dress. She did not cry, though she felt the tears pressing at the back of her eyes. She simply nodded, thanked Mr. Jessup, and walked out of the courthouse into the morning light. The men on the porch of the boarding house saw her emerge. They saw her walk down the steps with her head held straight, saw her turn onto the road that led to the hill, saw her pass the store without stopping. Ezra Platt called out again, "Did you pay it then?" But Clara did not answer. The receipt was warm against her chest, and that was answer enough. The dry spell came exactly as the men at the store had predicted. The first week brought no rain, and the second week brought only a single afternoon of spitting drizzle that evaporated before it wet the dust. The creek that ran through the bottomland dropped a foot, then another, until the exposed banks cracked and curled like old parchment. The corn in the bottomland began to wilt, the leaves curling inward, the stalks taking on a yellowish cast that spoke of thirst. Ezra Platt's field turned brown at the edges. Harlan Briggs's best pasture, the one that stretched along the river, lost its green and became a stretch of brittle yellow that crunched underfoot. Clara's hill, though, did not suffer. The sainfoin, with its deep roots that reached far into the earth, stayed green and blooming. The guinea fowl, sheltered in the cool of the cave, continued to lay their large eggs as though the sky had never stopped delivering rain. And the hidden spring, the chamber she had discovered, gave water that was cold and sweet and endless. Clara dug a shallow trench from the cave's entrance, channeling the overflow toward the garden patch where she had planted a few rows of beans and squash. The water ran clear and steady, and the garden grew. She did not boast about it. She did not go down to the store and tell Lee J. Morgan that her hill was thriving while his customers' fields were dying. She simply kept working, gathering the eggs, cutting the sainfoin, carrying water to the garden in a bucket she had carried up from the cabin. But the valley noticed. They noticed because the hill stayed green while everything around it turned brown. They noticed because Clara Sutton, the woman on the poor hill, had eggs to sell when no one else had anything. And they noticed because Ezra Platt, desperate and thirsty, came up the hill one evening with a bucket in his hand. "Miss Sutton," he said, and his voice was different from the voice that had laughed on the boarding-house porch. It was thinner, humbler. "The creek's gone dry. My well's giving mud. I got a wife and 3 children, and they haven't had a proper drink in 2 days. I heard you've got water up here." Clara looked at the bucket in his hand, then at the face of the man who had called out to her on the road. She thought of the laughter, of the rumor about her birds, of the years of being counted out and dismissed. She could have said no. She could have sent him back down the hill with nothing but the memory of his own mockery. But she looked at his wife and 3 children, who had never laughed at her, and she said, "Follow me." She led him to the cave, past the guinea fowl that parted around his feet, to the crack in the far wall. She had widened it enough to pass through, and she led him into the hidden chamber where the pool glittered in the lantern light. "Fill your bucket here," she said, "and tell your neighbors that if they need water, they can come. But they come with their own buckets, and they come with respect." Ezra Platt filled his bucket and carried it down the hill. By the next morning, a line of people had formed at the bottom of the slope, each carrying a bucket or a jug or a clay pot. Clara spent the day leading them up to the cave, one by one, and each of them saw the hidden chamber, the spring, the crystals that still glimmered on the walls. Some of them were the same men who had laughed on the boarding-house porch. They did not laugh now. They filled their buckets and thanked her, some barely meeting her eyes, and they walked back down the hill with their heads low. Harlan Briggs heard about the spring. He came up the hill on the 3rd day of the drought, not in his fine buggy but on foot, wearing a coat that was damp with sweat. He did not carry a bucket. He carried a folded paper, and Clara recognized it as the same paper he had shown her before, the preliminary claim he had filed at the courthouse. "Miss Sutton," he said, and his voice was stiff, forced through a throat that did not want to speak the words. "I have come to withdraw my claim." The hill is yours." I was wrong about it. He held out the paper, and she took it. "I did not think you could succeed. I did not think the land had anything to offer." I was wrong. She held the paper and looked at him. He was not the same man who had driven up in the buggy, confident and smiling. The drought had taken something from him, not just his pasture, but his certainty. He looked older, smaller, and the apology, though delivered through clenched teeth, was real. "I accept," she said, "and if you need water for your stock, you may send a wagon up with barrels. There is enough for the whole valley." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Then he nodded and walked back down the hill. The dry spell broke on the 10th day, with a slow, steady rain that fell for an entire afternoon and night. The valley breathed again. The creek rose, the fields began to green, and the line of buckets at the bottom of Clara's hill stopped forming. But the memory of that line did not fade. The people of Willow Creek remembered who had given them water when the creek ran dry. They remembered who had kept eggs on their tables when the chickens had stopped laying. They remembered who had stayed on the poor hill and turned it into something that could hold the whole valley together. And Clara, standing at the mouth of the cave, watching the rain fall on her green hill, understood that she had won more than a tax battle. She had won the hill itself, not just the legal right to it, but the deep, quiet knowledge that it had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. The guinea fowl gathered around her feet, the rain tapping on their feathers, and she thought of the queen, buried under the plum tree, and of the first 6 birds that had arrived in an apple crate. She had not known then what she was starting, but she knew now. Inside the cave, the hidden spring continued to rise, and the crystals caught the light from a candle she had set on a ledge, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. She went inside one more time, just to sit in the stillness, and she felt the hill all around her, the weight of it, the age of it, the patience of it. It had waited for her. It had held its secrets until she was ready to see them. And now, standing in the hidden chamber, with her hands resting on the cool stone, she began to plan what she would do next. The hill was not finished giving. It was just beginning. The rain fell for 30 hours without pause, a slow, soaking blessing that the valley drank like a man waking from a long thirst. Clara stood at the cave mouth and watched the water sheet off the hill, running in rivulets down the slope, gathering in the hollows, filling the creek at the bottom until it ran bankful and singing. The sainfoin lifted its purple heads, and the garden that had been watered from the hidden spring stretched its leaves toward the gray sky as though giving thanks. The guinea fowl emerged from the cave one by one and stood in the open, letting the rain wash the dust from their feathers, their low trills carrying through the wet air like a hymn. When the clouds broke on the second morning, the sun came out hot and bright, and the valley steamed. The bottomland that had been brown was beginning to green again, but slowly, tentatively, like a patient who had been very ill and was not yet sure of recovery. Ezra Platt's corn was a total loss. Half the stalks had dried beyond saving, and the rest would produce stunted ears at best. Harlan Briggs had lost nearly a third of his best pasture, and his cattle had grown thin on the sparse grass that remained. The whole valley had taken a wound, and the healing would take time. But Clara's hill had not only survived, it had flourished. The sainfoin had set seed, and she had harvested enough to plant twice the area next spring. The guinea fowl had produced nearly 200 eggs during the drought, and she had sold every one of them at a premium to Lee J. Morgan, who had finally stopped treating her like a charity case and started treating her like a supplier. The hidden spring had not diminished. It had flowed steadily through the driest days, and she had dug a second trench to channel water to a new patch of ground where she planned to plant potatoes. The hill, which the town had called poor for so long, had become the richest piece of land in the valley, and everyone knew it. The recognition came in pieces, small and slow, like the thaw after a long winter. Lige Morgan began greeting her by name when she came into the store, not as an afterthought, but as a customer he was glad to see. Ezra Platt stopped her on the road one afternoon and offered to help her mend the fence that had leaned for 4 years, and he did not mention payment. The women who had whispered about her birds now stopped to ask how she kept them so healthy, and Clara answered every question with the same quiet patience she had used with the birds themselves. But the fullest recognition came from Harlan Briggs, and it came on a Sunday afternoon in late June, when the prairie was thick with summer grass and the air smelled of clover. He drove up the hill in his buggy, but this time there was no confidence in his bearing, no smile on his face. He climbed down slowly, and Clara saw that he was holding something in his hands, a small wooden box, polished and plain. He walked to where she was sitting on the cabin stoop, shelling peas into a bowl, and he stopped a few feet away. The guinea fowl gathered at the edge of the yard, watching him with their calm, unblinking eyes. "Miss Sutton," he said. His voice was rough, as though the words were hard to push out. "I have come to apologize. Properly." Clara set down the bowl and waited. "I have been a fool about this hill," he said. "I thought I knew what land was worth. I thought I knew what a woman alone could do. I was wrong on both counts." He held out the box. "This is for you. It belonged to my mother. She kept it on her nightstand all her life. It's nothing valuable, but it has meant something to me. I want you to have it as a token of my respect." Clara opened the box. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small silver brooch shaped like a wild plum blossom, the petals delicate and finely wrought. It was not valuable in money, but it was beautiful, and it had been offered with a humility that cost Briggs more than any price he could have named. She looked up at him, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what you've done here, and I am sorry I tried to take it from you." He turned and walked back to his buggy, and Clara watched him drive away, the guinea fowl settling back into their grazing. She pinned the brooch to her dress above her heart, and she thought of the wild plum tree at the bottom of the slope, where the queen was buried. The petals had fallen weeks ago, but the tree was still there, rooted and alive, waiting for next spring. She went back to shelling her peas, and the sun climbed higher, and the hill hummed with the sound of insects and birds and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that had finally found its footing. That autumn, Clara harvested enough sainfoin seed to plant the entire south face of the hill. She built a proper chicken coop above the cave, though the guinea fowl still preferred the dark interior. And she sold breeding pairs to farmers from 3 counties over, at prices that made her gasp the first time she counted the money. She hired Ezra Platt's oldest son to help with the digging, and together they excavated the hidden chamber, widening the entrance until it could be entered standing upright, and they lined the spring with fieldstone so that the water ran clear and easy to reach. By the time the first snow fell, Clara Sutton had paid off every debt she had ever incurred, had enough flour and salt put by for 2 winters, and had become something the town of Willow Creek had never expected: a woman of standing. The hill was no longer called the poor man's hill. The name had faded, replaced by the simple phrase that everyone used: Sutton's place. On a cold December evening, with the fire crackling in the cabin stove and the guinea fowl settled in their cave, Clara sat at her kitchen table and looked at the receipt from the county clerk, the one that proved the hill was hers. She had kept it in the leather pouch next to the brooch from Harlan Briggs. She unfolded it and read the words for the 100th time, and she thought of the first 6 birds in the apple crate, of the hidden chamber and the crystals, of the drought and the line of buckets, of the queen buried under the plum tree. She thought of all the moments when she had almost given up, and of the stubborn thread that had kept her holding on. She set the receipt down and picked up the brooch, turning it in the firelight. The silver petals caught the glow, and she remembered the day Briggs had given it to her, the look on his face, not defeated, but changed. She pinned it to her collar, and she went outside to check on the birds one last time before bed. The moon was full, and the hill lay silver and still under the frozen sky. The cave entrance glowed faintly in the moonlight, and Clara ducked inside to find the guinea fowl roosting in their usual hollows, a pile of warm feathers and soft breathing. At the back of the cave, where the hidden chamber opened, she could hear the trickle of the spring, steady and constant, the same sound it had made every night since she had found it. She knelt and touched the water with her fingers, feeling the cold, the purity, the promise of it. She straightened and walked out into the night, the brooch catching the moon, the hill holding her in its quiet embrace. She had come to this place with nothing but a trunk of tools and a habit of talking to animals, and she had built a life from the very ground that everyone else had walked past. The frontier hid more than it showed, and she had been patient enough to wait for its secrets. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.